Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
I personally can't think of anything better to do than to find a good book, a comfortable space, and read.
Hello and welcome to Sundoku, the podcast for people with a bad case of Lesesucht. I'm Michaela Andreev.
And I'm Annie Hastwell. And Michaela, you love finding new words for book addiction. What's this one?
Lesesucht, it's from the German and it means an addiction to reading. It was coined in the 1700s, around the time people were beginning to enjoy reading just for the sake of reading, as opposed to, I suppose, reading for religious enlightenment.
The Bible.
Yeah, what we were supposed to be doing back then. As I was looking that one up, I actually found two other words that were also popular at the time. There's Lesewut, which means reading rage, and Leserei, which means reading mania.
Those Germans, they have such interesting words for things, some things that we can't really put into anything less than 10 words. But I bet the connotation was quite negative at the time because there was a lot of worry and moral panic in those early days about what reading was doing to young people particularly.
Yeah, giving them all these independent thoughts, God forbid.
Exactly, and the tendency of young women to read romance novels and get a bit carried away with the story, get emotionally involved.
Yeah, no, that's no good.
Sort of things we now worry about with Twitter and gaming and things like that with kids.
Yeah, exactly.
But it was just good old reading.
Yeah, well, it was considered a rage back then or, a mania. Anyway, we're certainly not ones to judge people's reading habits here at Sundoku.
Confirmed addicts.
Yes, I have to admit, I don't mind the occasional romance. You know where you're going. It's pure escapism. Don't have to think too hard. Especially those, I do love the Regency ones of Georgette Heyer and Jane Austen. They're just so relaxing, I think.
I think it's probably like a Hollywood movie thing where it is relaxing to know that the person you like isn't going to die at the end.
Yeah, exactly.
And the baddie probably will get their just desserts.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I'll be talking about that. I'll be talking about romance in our classic segment with creative writing PhD candidate Georgia Nicholls. I was just at Georgia's house recently recording my interview with her, and she has a Sundoku that is more than just a pile of books beside the bed. It is a set of bookshelves and a couple of coffee tables all piled high very neatly with romance book after romance book. She just loves them. She's also got a podcast called Love on Campus. And she's got a really fun Instagram page called Books I Think About, which is full of pithy reviews of romance books. So I think we can pretty safely say Georgia is addicted to love in the most lovely of ways.
Okay, and that's a good segue to our upcoming author interview. So I have my own personal addiction, secret pleasure, which is what's politely called speculative fiction, good sci-fi and dystopia. And there's a warning, you're going to hear the word vampire in this interview. And don't be put off. This week I tracked down American writer Justin Cronin, and he's a master of this genre. And he's a man with an amazing ability to take the reader into a future that is unrecognisable, but it's populated with people just like us that we like. And it's also chillingly plausible. You can, as the book progresses, you can make your way back to why this happened. And it's often, the big social solutions, medical and otherwise, that our society deals with. Anyway,
you've got me intrigued.
So this particular book, that was the one that made him famous, The Passage, and became a trilogy, is an odyssey across a mysteriously destroyed and dangerous America. It's absolutely terrifying. It has these vampire creatures in it who are sort of hiding out in abandoned motels and shopping centres, but they're kind of sad too. It's a very interesting story. Anyway, that one was my introduction to him a few years ago, and I couldn't put it down. A few novels later, he's produced The Ferryman, which is a utopia with a dystopian underbelly, of course, and it takes the reader on another mysterious sort of how do we get here journey. No vampires this time, because as Justin explained, he's a writer who likes to move on and try new things.
Every time I write a book, I try to do something new just at the level of narrative artistry. And I'd always wanted to write something that the reader would feel like they read twice by reading it once. You know, they read it from front to back along the way thinking one thing, and then something happens in the book and they're stopped dead in their tracks, and they turn around and kind of look down the hallway of the novel, and they say they've been reading a different story all along.
His work's inspired by everything from Planet of the Apes to Shakespeare.
That covers the full gamut. I'm sold.
Gives him some cred there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, let's go to that interview with Justin Cronin about his new book, The Ferryman. It begins in some not too distant future time on an island that seems like paradise at first.
Well, the world of the Ferryman is a world of the haves and have-nots. It's an island at some distant future time where the island is called Prospera. Its citizens are Prosperans, and they live in tremendous luxury. It's a society of creatives and people who are encouraged always to pursue personal excellence. And it's such a nice life that they don't actually die. When they reach the end of life, they board a ferry to a nearby island where, and nobody knows quite how this happens, they are reiterated. They return on the ferry as fresh-faced teenagers with no memory of their previous lives, ready to live it all again. And there's a third island called the Annex where the support staff lives. And these are the ordinary men and women who do the hard labor to keep this place running. And that's the premise of the book.
It has a lot of resonance, obviously, with how we live now, the rich and the privileged and the poor and the desperate and the first world versus the third world, except it's in this strange, geographic, puzzling, intriguing space, and birth and death are kind of out of sight on that third island. What are the aspects of the world we do live in now that inspired you to create this one?
A couple of things, but one above all, which is my profound concern about the upward flow of capital into a very narrow bandwidth of people, the 1% or the 1% of the 1%, who are of course the people with all the political and economic power and have really no motivation, no reason to try to fix the tremendous number of problems that we have. And history tells us that anytime a society ends up like this, where there's a very narrow bandwidth of people at the top, things don't end well. They actually only end one way. And I feel like we are in crisis, in peril because of this. And in fact, almost all of the problems that the world has right now are completely solvable. We just have a completely sclerotic politics that prevents us from solving them. Even climate change, we could stop climate change. We have all the technology we need. It's not perfect, but we're pretty close. But we have no reason to actually do it, or at least the 1% of the 1% has no reason to actually do it. And so it doesn't happen.
So yet you write a book that's so human, so enthralling, there is this message behind it and you get it, but at the same time it's just a brilliant novel. How do you keep that humanity in this world that you've created?
Well, a premise is, like the one I described at the beginning, and then say a concern, like the matters that I just spoke about, those aren't alive. That's inert material. It's an interesting conversation, I suppose. And you could look at the premise as an allegory or a miniaturized sort of snow globe version of the things in the world that concern me. But a novel only works if it's populated by warm new beings. And I can't remember who invented that term, but a term for a character, for a human story. And the only way people will ever really connect to the broad material and the broad concerns of a novel is if they have a way of inhabiting it for the period of time in which they're reading the book. So first and foremost, I write about the people in the story. I mean, that's my biggest concern is the characters. I put them in a situation and then I, allow them the freedom to enact their full humanity on behalf of the story that I want to tell.
So Proctor Bennett, he's the ferryman. Who is he and what drives him?
Well, Proctor's job is one part lawyer, one part cop, and one part psychotherapist. When people reach the decision that it's time to board the ferry, a ferryman it's his responsibility to guide them through the legal and emotional and logistical prospect of ending one life and starting another, escorting them to the ferry. And Proctor's a guy who's very, very good at this. He can talk with the paint right off the walls. If you're having any trouble with this, boy, he can make you feel A-OK about it. He's extremely good at his job, but he's also somebody who is, I say that this is like the world's longest midlife crisis novel in some ways. He's a gentleman of a certain age whose life appears perfect, but he feels a kind of deep agitation, a sense that things aren't right. And the novel essentially follows his journey, which becomes like, he becomes essentially an outlaw and then a revolutionary, follows his journey to kind of unmask the truth of his life, but also of this world.
One of the other things that drives the story, of course, is the people in the annex, which is the people that do all the work and aren't particularly happy. They start a kind of movement, a revolt movement. Tell us a little bit about that.
If people are going to be drinking the nice wine, somebody has to pour the wine, somebody has to crush the grapes. So there's a large underclass of the working poor living in a space that's rather like a walled ghetto. It's an adjacent island that's connected by a causeway with security checkpoints on it. And within those confines, there's a growing movement called arrivalism, which is a kind of cross between a religious awakening and a social justice movement. And often these two things throughout history is, the American Civil Rights Movement, for instance, began out and grew out of churches. So these sorts of movements often begin with religious or mystical underpinnings. And that's occurring in the annex now, where people are experiencing a sense that they are supposed to arrive somewhere, that there's a promised land in reward for earthly toil. And within that, there are a number of people who are kind of ready to stage revolution, violent revolution, on behalf of that. And so that's cooking in the background while Proctor is trying to figure out the truth of his own life. And eventually these two threads have to collide. I mean, Proctor ends up, and I don't want to give way too many spoilers,
No, don't.
He's drawn into that movement.
Actually, I have to say spoilers aren't really an issue in this, because I think your story gets so complicated that it will be very hard to give it away to anyone. They really need to get lost in this book.
No, it's been a very difficult book to talk about. People say, what's it about? And I'm like, well, not what you think it is, because that's really true. I mean, the book has a big reveal, a big twist about 2/3 of the way through that rewrites everything in your head, which was one of the goals I had writing the book. Every time I write a book, I try to do something new just at the level of narrative artistry. And I'd always wanted to write something that the reader would feel like they read twice by reading it once. They read it from front to back along the way thinking one thing, and then something happens in the book and they're stopped dead in their tracks, and they turn around and kind of look down the hallway of the novel, and they say they've been reading a different story all along. The inspiration for this, I'm totally convinced, was my experience in 1972. Maybe I was probably 10 years old, watching Planet of the Apes for the first time. And it was possible back then to watch the original, the Planet of the Apes, the Charlton Heston Planet of the Apes, without knowing how it ended, with that big reveal at the end. And all of a sudden, the whole story is instantly changed in the last 2 minutes. And when I was 10 years old and saw this on my parents' little black and white television, I think my brains came out my ears. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. It was the most amazing effect. And I'd always wanted to do that. I always wanted to see if I could pull it off. It's not easy, too. I'll tell you, this book went through 17 drafts.
Just for someone who hasn't seen Planet of the Apes, can you just sum up that twist at the end?
The final moment of the original Planet of the Apes, Charlton Heston is an astronaut. He's landed on a planet of apes where human beings are essentially in the role of the beasts that are domesticated, and the apes are in charge. And at the end of it, Charlton Heston escapes from the clutches of ape society and travels away into what is called the Forbidden Zone. And in the very last moment of the movie, what he sees is the Statue of Liberty in ruins. And what he realizes is that he's been on planet Earth all along. This is the future of his own world. And it's mind-blowing. It's an unbelievable moment that, certain moments in narrative will just go into you and stay there. For me, it just went into me and stayed there. And so now, probably 50 years later, half a century later, I'm trying to pull the same trick.
Your books are so complex. they're a challenge, a delightful challenge to sort of follow you through, especially with this one as it gets towards the end. How do you write? Do you kind of let the story tell itself, or do you do a lot of planning?
Well, you have to do a lot of planning. This is my thesis, which is the book needs to really know itself, that the first sentence needs to know what the last sentence is in order to make, the kinds of choices along the way that you need to get there. And so I never begin a book unless I know how it ends, for starters. I have to know what's the final moment, even what's the final sentence. And then you kind of work backward from there and figure out, okay, how does this premise, this beginning, get to this ending? And I do my best to map it out in as much detail as I can. The Passage, for instance, had an extremely detailed roadmap. This book had a less detailed roadmap because I kept running into complex questions. In order to make the big trick work, I constantly had to go back and forth, kind of recalibrating. I had something in the plan. I'm like, wait, that doesn't work. So you're constantly moving back and forth, and new opportunities arise just as new problems arise. But I really do try to plan something pretty carefully because, as I said, I think when you start a novel, you can feel the novel and the writer's understanding of the book. Like you can feel that underneath the surface, that the person who's telling you the story knows what the story is.
I have in common with a lot of your reviewers that I just wanted to stay living in this world. I've got so deeply enmeshed in it. Do you, as the writer, have trouble letting go of the worlds and the characters that you create?
It's an interesting question. I've wrestled with that. I often find myself, when I'm done with a book, sort of at very loose ends psychologically, because I've realized I've been borrowing a lot of my emotional life, my inner life, from the characters and the stories that I've been telling. And the problem of writing a novel is that writing a novel is just like raising children. You're supposed to get them to the place where they will leave you. Which is, that's what you do as a parent. You get to the place where they fire you from your job. And so, you finish a novel and you have to kind of stand on the pier and watch the story sail away. And it kind of puts me in an odd emotional and psychological condition for a little while.
And then you start writing again?
Until something else comes along, until I'm ready to start the next thing, and then I'll just sort of glide into that, and my brain will be working on it 24 hours a day. When you write a book, at least for me, I'm writing it 24 hours a day, and somewhere in my head there's a room in which it's being worked out all the time. And only when it's published, they always say that what's the best thing about publishing a book, and the answer is you never have to write it again. But like I said, you've been fired, so you also need to go get a new job.
Let's just talk briefly about The Passage, which was the book that propelled you to fame, really. An amazing odyssey across America, an America in ruins that we don't know why, populated by superhumans who are on the hunt for fresh blood, who are totally terrifying vampire kind of creatures. What drove you to the vampire idea there?
I wanted to write a book in which a very small group of people were, fighting to survive in a world of constant peril, because it seemed to me that was a great tool for characterization. If you're running for your life at all times, you cannot help but be yourself. And I needed the right boogeyman for it, and I'd always been very attracted to the vampire narrative in terms of its plasticity, its flexibility. We basically have four monsters. You get your Frankensteins, you get your werewolves, you get your zombies, and you get your vampires. And the werewolves, the zombies, and the Frankensteins are actually pretty straightforward. They don't have a lot of detail to them. But vampire mythology, and when we talk about vampires, we're really talking about a kind of Eastern European folk tale. It's full of details. You have, the garlic and the crosses, and they can't see themselves in mirrors, and you have the kind of whole sexual seductive aspect to it, and you have sleeping in your native soil, like all of this stuff that our other monsters don't really have. And as a consequence, you can do a lot of different things with it. And I had noticed across the years when I was, learning to eat my peas off a fork as a writer, I'd seen two movies, one of them great and one of them not so great, but two different vampire movies that took the vampire story and did very, very interesting things with it. And the best example I can give is a film by Catherine Bigelow, who, of course, has become an enormously important director. but it was a sort of B movie from early in her career called Near Dark. Basically, vampires drive around the American West in the Winnebago, killing people, like killing everybody at a roadhouse bar. And what's happened is that the vampire myth has been, the vampire narrative, its mythology has been soldered onto a sort of American horror model, which is the highway drifter serial killer. It's a kind of Western trope. So vampires, and it's a Western, right? And I thought that was really interesting because I'd only ever thought of vampires in terms of, the dark shadows, the cape, all that sort of traditional stuff. And then I saw the Bram Stoker's Dracula that was made in, I think, 92. That had Keanu Reeves and Gary Oldman in it, and of course it's not a good movie. Okay, I'll just be the first to say this. But if you watch that movie carefully, it's absolutely soaked in blood, and it takes the seduction metaphor, the seduction aspect of vampirism, right, and turns it super sexual. The movie was really addressing and speaking to and allegorizing the AIDS crisis that in 1992 was absolutely devastating. Essentially, vampirism is a sexually transmitted disease. And again, I saw and thought to myself, wow, you can do so much with this stuff that's interesting and important. And it just felt like it was, all this stuff I think was just kind of like preparing me later on when I wanted to write a novel, a sort of apocalyptic story, and I needed the boogeyman for it. Like, that's what drew me to it.
And what about your vampires, though? There's something needy and they're horrible, they're terrifying, but at the same time, they're sad.
Mm-hmm. They're just sick people. They're just people with a disease. The premise of the passage is that there's a scientist who believes that all these legends are actually based on a pathogen that creates symptoms that are analogous to the features of the vampire that have been mythologized, including spectacularly long-livedness, right? Because that's there's one desirable quality, if you could grab it, which is the fact that vampires live forever. And most people would like to. I personally don't, but it's a very attractive idea. And so this guy goes searching for the virus with the idea that he can use it actually to cure everything, like all major diseases, to slow aging. Every aspect of the vampires in the passage has they're all drawn from nature. They're all plausible in the sense that there are things that I've identified in the physical and the biological world that could serve as the basis for a magical, the vampire that we think of as basically a magical being that could be the basis for a magical feature. And the best example of that is the fact that vampires, according to the mythology, cannot see themselves in mirrors, right? Which is impossible. Like, everything made of molecules shows up in a mirror. So what could have been the origin of that? And the answer is what happens when a very, very sick person looks at themselves in the mirror. The creatures of the passage, these people infected with this virus, when they encounter their own reflection, of course they see it. But at that moment, they are transfixed with the tragedy of what they've become.
Right. Oh. Now, it's been made into a series. How do you feel about the series?
Disappointing to me. I had very little to do with it. It was bought outright. I had no control or authority or much of a role with it, and I thought it was, at the end of the day, kind of arbitrary. And it was a bunch of very smart people working very hard, and I don't want to disparage anybody who's involved with the project. But for me, it wasn't what I would have done. Let me put it that way.
It's a credit to the power of the imagination. Like, my son, who's a big fan of yours, said that he doesn't want to see the series because the book lives in his head and he doesn't want it spoiled.
Well, what happens when you see the film or television version of a novel is that one version of it gets fixed in your head. A book isn't a thing, it's an event. It happens every single time it's read and only when it's read. But each time it happens, because it's mixing with the mind of an individual and a reader, right? It's a little bit different. So there's actually, in theory, an infinite number of versions of any book. What happens when it's on the screen in one way or another is that's a fixed version of the story that becomes everybody's, and it can push away all the other ones. Sometimes it's fantastic. Sometimes that one vision of the story is so beautiful and well done that it can compete with the novel in some way that's a fair fight. But it's not simple.
Just finally, this book, obviously, I'm a big fan of the dystopia and the utopian dystopia, which this is. I'm talking about the Ferryman again. It has echoes of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, like the darker side of utopias. So I was wondering, who are your favourite writers, who are your heroes of fiction who have influenced you along the way?
Oh, it's a totally mixed bag. The underpinnings of my love of story come from the sort of classic boyhood science fiction of my era. I was born in 1962, and there was, the golden age of science fiction. So 2001, A Space Odyssey, with its sublime vision of the cosmos, and Planet of the Apes, Ray Bradbury, Asimov. The other literary antecedents for me from that period are certain novels about the end of the world. I was a Cold War kid. I was very anxious about the state of humanity. I was quite concerned that I would be incinerated before I was 20. And books like The Last Babylon and Earth Abides and On the Beach, these were important for me as well. And then, later I had a more formal education in literature. And so I encountered the beauty of language and complex literary text. And this is something most people haven't noticed, but every book has another book over its shoulder. There's one book that's kind of like pressing on it. And for the Ferryman, it's The Tempest. A magician on a magical island. Like, it's, almost every little feature of The Tempest, the major features of The Tempest, are present in the Ferryman, which I didn't realize until I'd been writing the book for a little while. And, of course, I named the place Prospera. And, Proctor as a name is a slight linguistic variation on that. And all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, I'm writing The Tempest.
Oh, so you don't even realize you're doing it.
Yeah, it took me a little while to kind of catch up to that one. But when I did, and, people who read the novel and get past the twist will see why this really is connected. Yeah, it took me a while to see it, but once I did, I understood, and even more deeply, the ways in which we can be kind of inhabited by a book or a play. I hadn't read The Tempest since 1983 when I read it in college, and I'd never seen it performed. But it was one of those things that you read and it just goes into you and it stays.
American writer Justin Cronin talking about his new book, The Ferryman. It's a big read, but I did not want to put it down.
So now let's move from dystopia to perhaps utopia, the world of romance, with PhD candidate and casual academic Georgia Nicholls. Georgia, you're 23 years old, you've got a Bachelor in Commerce, but you're now studying and teaching creative writing with a special focus on romance. What changed for you?
So I think I always wanted to study something creative, but I was a little scared when I first left high school. So I did the commerce degree and I did it in marketing because I thought that would be a little bit more creative for me. But you get so many electives when you do commerce. And so everything that I filled up my electives with was creative writing. And I sort of ended up with a creative writing major, basically, but not official. And one of my lecturers mentioned honours in creative writing, and I thought I'd ask and see if I could apply for it as a commerce student. He said yes.
Fabulous.
I submitted and I got in. And a really good academic that I could study under, her name came to me, Dr. Amy Matthews, when I was in honours. And so I applied for the PhD and now I'm a year and a half into it.
Such a happy change for you.
Yeah, just more passion, I suppose, for it and what I'm studying. And
I understand you have a real passion for romance literature.
yes.
Is that what you write as well?
It is what I write. I probably also delve into women's fiction as well, which is supposedly a little bit different, less romance heavy. But yeah, romance has sort of always been the focus, even from, I used to write fan fiction in high school.
Did you? Was it Twilight fan fiction?
It wasn't Twilight, it was Harry Styles.
Okay.
Which, tomato, I suppose. But,
That's great.
Yeah, if you ask anyone I went to school with, it's like, yep, Georgia used to read and write that all the time. That was, sort of makes sense that I'm here now.
Has any of it been published and read by others? How do you go about your fan fiction?
Yeah, I published it on Wattpad, which is like an online platform. And one of them did pretty well. It has like 200,000 reads, I think it is. But that includes like per chapter. So it's like 200,000 divided by 40 would be like how many people have read it, basically.
Do you get paid for that?
You don't. You kind of just do it because you want to read about Harry Styles as your boyfriend, I suppose. And you want to write about it.
Imagine if he read it.
Well, there are lots of like Harry Styles fan fictions that have been turned into movies and like actual books. It's a big market in itself.
What sort of romance do you like to read now?
There's so many genres. It's insane. But I usually lean towards contemporary romance, so stuff that's set nowadays with modern women, with modern problems. I think that sort of dating and romance in the 21st century is always a bit disappointing a bit sometimes, and so it's nice to read a story where it's happy and it works out. And
exactly.
So that's usually what I go for.
So what are some of the other genres?
One of the big ones that probably people associate with, romance not being the best kind of literature, I suppose, would be like historical romances. The ones with the like Fabio covers, the shirtless men and the long hair and all that sort
Women
of stuff.
being dominated by big burly men.
Exactly, in like, the Scottish Highlands. Or
kilts, that's understandable.
Yeah, kilts. Or, medieval England, I don't know. So there's those. And Regency usually gets its own subgenre because that's the really popular historical subgenre. Like that's where everyone goes.
Do people still write in that genre?
Yeah,
they still
hugely.
do. Okay.
Yeah, which is you don't really see it as much because it's more like Mills and Boon stuff. It's not like in the bookstore type romance. Bookstore romance is more contemporary romance. And then there's stuff like romantasy. That's really big at the moment. So romance with fantasy.
Oh, that's not time travel, is it? So that's more...
Well, it could be time travel.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's anything that's just a bit like not of this world. So a really popular one recently was A Court of Thorns and Roses.
Oh, my daughter, who's your age, has read that.
Yes.
Loved it.
Yes.
A Court of Thorn and Roses, wasn't it? Who's that by?
Sarah J. Maas is her name. Very popular. And then there's paranormal romances, mafia romances. They're just endless. Like there's everything under the sun.
So you've got your genre of romance. Then what are the literary tropes in romance? What's the difference?
You can sort of think about it as the babushka doll, if you will. Like you've got the genre, romance, and then you have the subgenres, so historical, contemporary, all that sort of stuff. And then the tropes span all sorts of subgenres. So enemies to lovers is a trope, and that can sort of exist anywhere, like in historicals or contemporary. Then you have little tropes like shared beds, like when they have to share a bed and they don't want to share a bed. I'm trying to think about all the other ones, like Grumpy Sunshine is one, when there's like the grumpy character but then like the really happy character, but they're falling in love.
Okay, you know the ones where it's like you see a lot of them on Netflix, and I'm sure they're in literature as well. The Christmas story. So that's not a trope, is it? That's a genre.
Actually, Christmas is a good example. A lot of those have very typical tropes that they'll use. So they're often in small towns or like a hometown. It's usually like big city woman, small town man, or
with muscles.
Yes, exactly. And he's a bit of a lumberjack or something like that.
Who's writing some of the best romance at the moment?
Well, I love Emily Henry. She is my favourite. I think that she's revolutionising romance.
How?
Personally. She is taking modern concepts of career and relationships and family and making them really funny and engaging and lighthearted, but in a way that still helps you feel hopeful and aspirational about your life a bit. And Beth O'Leary is really good as well.
Now, I think someone else has mentioned Beth O'Leary to me. So can you think of any of titles that she's written that were particularly good?
So she has The Flat Share and then The Road Trip is another one. The No-Show, she's good. She almost like leans away from romance a little bit. Like she's almost a little bit women's fiction, or like chick lit.
That's what I was going to bring up, because chick lit, when I was your age, that's what it was called.
Yeah, like Bridget Jones's Diary type situation.
Yeah, which I just rewatched recently with my daughter. That is still good.
Oh, it's the best.
I should say reread, but I didn't. I rewatched, sorry. But then it sort of became almost a bit of a put down on the women who were writing it, or the women who were reading it. Did it become passé to younger readers? And is it a bit of a put down to call things chick lit now?
It just sort of happens where you have women's stories put down because they're just about women and the struggles that they have a lot of the time. I don't know, you can't read about women and be interested in women's stories because whatever women are interested in is just not as valuable, apparently.
Yeah. It's funny, I was just reading an article yesterday in The Conversation, and it was about a book called Ex-Wife. And it was written about the same time that The Great Gatsby was written.
Right.
And her name is Parrott, her surname, and she outsold The Great Gatsby by hundreds and hundreds of thousands. So he might have sold, say 40,000 copies if he was lucky. She sold 200 and something thousand copies.
Yeah.
This is in their first print runs kind of thing. And it covered really similar situations with, infidelity and changing world, 1920s, that kind of thing. And her book was called a romance, and her book was kind of never really accepted by the critics. The Great Gatsby was never called a romance, whereas it was as much a romance as Ex-Wife, and it didn't sell terribly well, but it was supported by so many of the critics that I didn't know The Great Gatsby was 150,000 copies were printed and sent to the troops during, it must have been Second World War, just for them to read. So it got such a leg up.
Yeah, because they sort of see it as like a more viable story because it's about, Jake Gatsby and his triumphs and his pitfall, all that sort of stuff. Whereas a story about a woman in her marriage with infidelity, with all that sort of stuff, all of a sudden is like, why would we care about that? Yeah.
What are you writing for your PhD?
I'm really interested in women my own age and how they experience romance and love, in a sort of dating app age. And so it's about these girls who go on a Europe trip because, that's what we're all doing now post-COVID.
Yep.
And one of them sort of stays in Paris and she has a bit of a fling and romance with a Parisian tattoo artist. Is sort of the idea. And then I hope that there's books about her friends as well. And they'd be like, set in different cities. So Paris for one.
That's a great idea. Do you dream of becoming a full-time writer? Is that the life you want, sitting in a quiet room writing love stories?
I don't know. I've had a bit of like a crisis, as you do when you're 23 years old, about what I want to do and what I want sort of my life to look like. And I think part of it I would like to involve writing and like being a novelist in that capacity. It's not totally sustainable as a full-time career, unfortunately, unless you're like, Stephen King. But I would like some aspect of my life to involve writing and potentially novel writing.
It sounds like it always has, so no change in a sense.
Yeah, I think I would always write anyway. So it'd be nice if there was some sort of monetary compensation for it, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the goal.
Yeah.
Now, we always ask people, what do you have on your Sundoku?
Endless books, truly. So a couple in there at the moment are books by my PhD supervisor, Amy Matthews. She released a book called Someone Else's Bucket List, which I really do need to read, like desperately. And then she also has another book out called Marrying Off Morgan McBride, which is like a Western romance. And currently I'm reading a book called Duck à la Orange for Breakfast, which is an Australian romance author. And I'm really thoroughly enjoying that so far.
Sounds good. What happens with the duck à la orange?
I think the concept is that she is like broken up with by her boyfriend and she cooks all the recipes in his family's cookbook. So it's her ex's family cookbook and she like cooks her way through it. And I think she falls in love with a different guy at the same time.
Oh,
yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, unusual, but nice.
Yeah, unusual, but like fun. And it's all about French food and cooking. And enjoyable.
Yeah, what's not to like?
Yeah, escapist.
That was Georgia Nicholls, PhD candidate and casual academic at Flinders University, talking about the biggest book market in the world, romance.
And this is Sundoku, the podcast for those afflicted with the most civilised of all afflictions, book addiction.
Hi, I'm Eve. I'm 21 years old and I have just read The Mother by Jane Caro. This book captivated me from the beginning because it is about a family experiencing domestic violence and coercive control. The book is about a recently widowed mother, Miriam Duffy. She's a devoted mother and grandmother. Miriam is thrilled when her youngest daughter, Ali, marries the love of her life, Nick. Ali moves out to the country to support Nick at his job being a vet. Ali begins to withdraw from conversations with Miriam and not invite her over to meet her 2 new grandchildren. But Miriam tries to give her daughter distance with her new marriage. Miriam goes 2 years without seeing her daughter regularly. Her other daughter has suspicions about Ali's new husband, Nick. Eventually, the truth about her daughter's situation is revealed, leaving Miriam in disbelief. Miriam finds her daughter is in an abusive relationship with Nick, and the legal system isn't designed to help women in this situation. Ali finally flees this relationship with her 2 young children to live with Miriam, but this is when all the horror begins. Miriam is faced with an unthinkable decision. What I liked about the book was that it was fast-paced and it kept me guessing what was to come, and I couldn't really predict the outcome, and you really find yourself hoping for a certain outcome. But I don't want to spoil it for anyone, so I won't tell you what the outcome is.
We would love to hear what you're reading at the moment, so if you've got a book that you'd like to tell us about, something that's taken your fancy, do a voice memo and send it to us at sundokucast@gmail.com. And that's it for Sundoku today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Michaela Andre of Happy Reading, and catch you next time.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.